Wrath of Angels. Chapter 4, Scene 3, The Daemonic Rising. On the shrine world Veyla, in a reliquary spire, nightfall of the same planetary rotation, month 6, year 260, the 41st millennium. The first sign was not light, but persuasion. Stone altered its opinion of itself. All along the wrecked promenade of Veyla's great shrine district, the reliquaries trembled on their plinths as if deciding to breathe. Hairline cracks found each other and made families. Dust lifted without wind and hung there like a congregation waiting for the priest to speak. The bells toppled where they'd been half buried by the sack, then rolled in fits and starts until each found a hollow that fitted the curve of its desire. The wind carried ash. The ash carried whispers. The whispers wore the voices of the dead and of the living who would shortly join them. In the shadow of a toppled saint, a woman in a soot-streaked habit clutched a split icon to her breast and tried to kneel, but the ground rose under her like a breath and set her on her feet again. She croaked the names she had left, each name smaller than the last. Across the plaza, a man whose wrists were twined with prayer cords used the sharp edge of a broken censer to sawingly cut his tongue and held the wet thing up in both palms, eyes ecstatic, as if he were giving a red fish back to a river. A boy with ash-white hair hid beneath a fallen arch and kissed the corner of a scorched banner tilt until his lips bled, whispering to the pole, bargaining for the miracle it had once held aloft. The sky above the spire's shattered crown bruised to a color the eye could not memorize. A seam ran from horizon to zenith, then unstitched. The tear did not open so much as decide to be an answer instead of a question. The air thickened. The light went thin. The sound became a pressure on the inside of skulls. The rift widened over the spire like an eye that had forgotten to blink. Something moved behind it. Something that was not in the world, but had the world in hand. You could not draw its face, because wherever your charcoal went, the paper disagreed. But its wings cast a judgment shape upon the plaza, vast, taloned, written in shadow. Its presence laid a law across the stones. It spoke without a mouth, and words made of no fell like hail. The fallen will rise as chaos. The first legend will be undone. The habit woman smiled and sobbed amen in the same breath. The tongueless man gurgled approval around blood. The ash-white boy pressed his face harder to the banner's iron and said in a voice he had borrowed, "Angels." The reliquaries vomited their contents. Bloodletters arrived in ranks like bad scripture taught by a cruel teacher. Their swords dragged, chiseling words into the floor that no one should learn. Ash wolves shook out of the rift in packs, coats of cinder combed by heat, eyes like coals that had decided to look back. Bone flies knitted in mid-air, each ribbed wing a thread on a loom no sane hand would work, and fell on the living like weather that had finally run out of sky. Shadow beasts pushed themselves free from thicker shadows, all elbow and hinge and intent. "Angles 3 and 8, Kalen voxed, voice clipped enough to shave with. "Celian, lanes." Acknowledged. Celian's reply was the coolness people mistakenly call mercy. His auspex painted geometry where the city had stopped pretending to be straight. Contra-spiral. Don't believe stairs. Orath, no further than my mark. Orath revved as if laughter could be talk. Veyna took a roofline, and without ceremony or thrill, began to murder anything that looked like a leader. Ravenwing bikes howled, black as denial. They cut lanes through the press, carving corridors where moments earlier there had been only nonsense. Bricks stretched to meet tires, and then remembered humility. A door decided to be a throat, and then choked on a bolt around. Orath jumped an aisle that none of them had crossed before because it hadn't existed, landed, and the landing killed a shadow beast, because punctuation is violence in the right sentence. The Emerald Vow saw the tide and lifted their banner. On me! Varican's voice was the bar a man takes in both hands when the road goes bad. Malven unfurled the cloth. Green cut the ash dim with a steadiness that insulted the storm. Ephraim's voice cracked and mended mid-prayer. Torvain put his foot against a broken reliquary base and turned his weapon into doctrine. Garen cuffed Jorath's helm with hard love that sounded like iron on iron. Eyes, not ghosts, fire. The vow advanced like a wall already built elsewhere and delivered here for the convenience of the enemy. The ash wolves met them and insisted. The wall insisted harder. Heat washed back off ceramite. Every third bolt left a smoking hole where a head had been, and a sermon only the dead could hear. Ephraim's vox gave up its last sweetness, and his words came out as gravel. That suited him fine. Gravel is what roads are made of. The shrine woman with the split icon stepped forward into the banner's green and tried to hand the icon up to Malven. She had meant to say, please. An ash wolf arrived in the space where the word would have been, and she went down in obedience to the world's easiest command. Stormwing, Corvian on the left, hold the mouth. Varican snapped. Corvian ran as if the ground had poles set under it for their feet to find. They hit the stairmouth just as it decided to be two stairmouths. The sergeant did not argue with moods. Litany of fire, he said, as if reciting the alphabet while someone set the room alight. First vow. They fired in the rhythm that makes fear remember how to count. The first burst turned wolves into bad weather. The second cut 4 bloodletters into 8 problems that were briefly worse. The third burst never finished. Warp fire came through them like an opinion. Brother Corris took it full and burned from the inside out, joints little chimneys. Brother Tavian inhaled bone flies, and his chest hummed until Ephraim reached him and traded the hum for a single, clean shout of flame. Brother Hellion steadied his bolter against the body of a man he had just shot for kindness, because the man's lungs had started to spell. Hold, the sergeant repeated, left arm hanging, and rammed a magazine home with his right and his teeth. A crashing like furniture getting thrown down a stairwell announced Thelonious and his Sternguard taking the far right. They did not talk. They conjugated munitions. Kraken, said veteran Marvek, because the target wore armor and deceit. Dragonfire, said Yaren, because the air was a throat. Hellfire, said Boar, and boneflies turned to glass and fell like rain. Vengeance, said Thelonious, and put 3 shells into a Bloodletters sermon until the sermon was a small red stain that no one would read again. A thrall ran from an alley with his chest stitched like a purse. Garen shot him, and he kept coming because the purse had been sewn with an intention other than mercy. Bomb, Celian said almost idly, and Brother Torvain pivoted and did the arithmetic. The detonation scraped the square raw. Jorath flinched. Garen's gauntlet hit his helm like a promise. Stand, he said, and Jorath learned that obedience is a machine you can climb into and drive. Over them all the rift opened wider, and in it the shadow shifted like a thing searching its pockets for a face it could wear. It did not step through. It did not need to. The sense of wings deepened. The plaza felt smaller. Words dropped into the world not as information, but as nails. The fallen will rise as chaos. The first legend will be undone. The child under the arch laughed a little, hiccuped, and began repeating the words in perfect cadence, because small mouths are perfect instruments when something strong plays them. Garen's bolt took his head quietly. No one looked at Garen and said his name like a question. The work left no room. Dominiel heard the voice all the way down in his knees. Circle, he said, not loudly, not dramatically. The oathbound of the sanctum moved in obedience so old it was hardly a choice. Lutharian's shield planted with a noise like a chapel door, convinced that the correct prayer had finally arrived. Abriath's helm tilted 5 degrees, measuring, subtracting, dividing bodies into angles. Ramiel hefted his storm mace, and thunder crawled along the haft like something drawn from a hole in the ground and taught to sit. Zephanis grinned like someone about to do something stupid and therefore necessary. Dominiel's hand closed on Mortalis, and iron purred. Between the oathbound and the thing in the rift, an angel descended. It was made of mirror and shadow, and the idea a liar has of a saint. Its wings were panes of glass that reflected only the viewer's worst day. Its sword was a shard of window that had remembered a cathedral and renounced humility. It touched the ground and did not weigh anything. When it lifted its blade, Dominiel saw his own arm moving in the wrong place, wearing mistakes he hadn't yet had the honor to commit. It lunged, and Dominiel met himself. The impact rang around the plaza and went somewhere none of them would follow. Shard edge slid along flail chain and cut a wrong sound out of the air. Zephanis went low, too gleeful to disguise the truth of it, and the mirror turned its head and saw Zephonis's grin and tried to grin back and sliced its own cheek in the attempt. Ramiel hit its knee. The knee remembered it was architecture and cracked obediently. Lutharian's shield rim kissed its wrist, and the wrist tried to be persuaded. Abriath called, "Angle 7, reject left," and the mirror rejected, because when geometry speaks, liars answer. From the rift, the shadow shifted and gestured without hands. Bloodletters broke from their tidy lines and ran in miserable threes. Wolves peeled wide to circle in from behind. Flies thickened around the banner where mortal hope burned easiest. "Kaelin," Cillian said, "your lane behind the vow. Orath, you will not like this." He drew a curve on the world, and Orath rode it like a bad joke you can't help laughing at. Bikes screamed across the square. Wolves leapt and were punctuation in the road that came after. The mirror fainted high and returned low, and Dominiel had already moved because Abriath had already spoken. Mortalis swung and their circles met. Sparks nipped children from the air and raised them into life, then let them die. The mirror smiled his smile and said nothing in his voice, and the emptiness of it was nearly worse than a lie with effort. Zephanis laughed too loud and got a pain across the mouth and came away grinning with ribbons of himself in his teeth. Anchor. Varrican voxed on a private line none of them remembered opening, and Varadale stepped as if that were his cue. He had learned not to fear pictures. They were always trying to get theatre jobs in the mind. He let them audition and then cut them without malice. Wards crawled his armor. His force blade hummed the first bar of a hymn and then decided to be a straight line instead. He raised his hand, and a chain no one could see, except by the way it changed the behavior of reality, looped around the mirror's waist. The thing bent like a reed under a hand. Hold. Varadil breathed through blood. He saw the rift as a hole a man could fall into, even if he never left the ground. He saw a forest breaking itself, trees uprooting to walk out into a storm. He saw the wrath drift sideways and sing to an empty choir. He saw watchers with parchment over their own faces. He refused all of it like a polite man declining a second helping. "Silence protects the truth," Malchadek said, stepping to Varadiel's left as if the world had sent him an invitation written on stone. He did not raise his voice yet. He set the Crozius down. The head chimed and a circle had an edge again. Silence denies the lie. That was louder, and one of the Bloodletters seemed to notice that its sword had been nonsense all along and put the blade down to look at its hands before Ephraim blew a hole through both. "Silence judges the unworthy," Malchadek finished, and the plaza learned a beat, thud, 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 and men who had been falling discovered that their spines were available for use. The mirror tried to speak with Dominiel's mouth. Melchizedek's litany refused to give it vocabulary. Mortalis hit it in a mood, and a web of cracks spread over the glass face. The fragment that was Dominiel's left eye slid an inch out of place and blinked once with a kind of respect. "Break it," Abriath said, not as an order, but as a comment on the nature of glass. Zephanis did not need telling twice. He went through the wrong gap at the wrong time and therefore right. The mirror turned to meet him. The shard sword came down, and the knight's laughter came up under it like a wedge. It stuck. Ramiel hit it like punctuation with a sense of humor. Lutherian's shield wrote no across the mirror's middle. Mortalis came in from the horizon, and the mirror became ruins in a rain. The rift shadow laughed, a contract tearing, and the plaza dimmed, and wolves arrived from everywhere at once. "Jorath," Garen said. He did not say, "Don't." He said the boy's name and made the name carry the weight. Jorath fired. A wolf that had been a house fire in the shape of hunger fell in pieces and ardor. Bone flies found his mouth, and he gagged and tried to keep shooting, and Garen flicked a knife hand into the swarm and cut a tunnel for the boy to breathe through. "Fire," Garen said again. The universe simplified to a verb. The man who had cut his tongue found the courage to run at a bloodletter and hug it. The bloodletter accepted the hug by reciprocating with a blade up under the ribcage, and they both became an art that no one would hang. The ash-white boy under the arch smiled when the Ravenwing went past. Then his smile blew away, as if it had been painted on. Thelonious ran out of long words and reloaded the short ones. Veyna put a bolt through a cultist priest's jaw, and the sermon stopped with a surprised "ah" that sounded very human and very tired. Orath rode too high into a snarl of bone flies and came down blind, laughing, because that is the material he has. Tyrion reached into the fog of wings and pulled him through with a tow cable you could call friendship if you liked melodrama. The rift shadow lifted a hand that was not a hand, and wolves that should not have been there arrived behind the vow. "Back!" Varricon snapped, and Malvern moved with the banner like a sail catching a dangerous wind and tacking from it. Ephraim's sermon ran out and he kept moving his mouth, and whatever came out was not words but older than words, and did the job just the same. Torvain burned a corridor in the new wolves, and looked surprised to find his boots still on the ground afterwards. "Kaelin," Celian said, "you have 6 seconds before the square reconsiders itself." 4, Kaelin corrected, but he moved like a man decided. The bikes chewed an arc through wolves that did not know they were already dead. Orath killed something by being heavy again. Celian's voice on the line was the razor on which they all remembered balance. The mirror tried to become a new shape out of its own wreckage. Abriath's sword said no with academic interest. The pieces shivered, learned their lesson, and tried a different sin. Dominiel set Mortalis down like a bricklayer, setting truth into a corner, and the sin failed to meet code. "Hold," Varadil said again. He had begun, without meaning to be unkind, to cry openly. Every tear was a ward bead hitting his cheeks and cooling there. The chain at his wrist sang one note, and the note had teeth. The shadow turned its unseen face toward Varadil then, and the librarian saw for a fraction of a breath a page in a book he had always refused to own. The prince realized as a single line of script, written in a hand that mocked all hands. It did not step through, it pointed. Bloodletters came in files 3 by 3. Wolves swam wide. The flies thickened like the room was filling up with a different kind of air. The cultists began to chant with more confidence, because they would soon be rebuked permanently, and that is the only safety they believed in. Now, Abriath said, as if he'd seen the shape of the paragraph. The Oathbound moved as one complex refusal. Lutharian's shield made a wall that taught wolves manners. Ramiel's mace wrote a rhythm on the ground that ground learned quickly. Zephanis went where no man who loved himself would choose, and came away missing part of himself and laughing because a man might as well be consistent. Dominiel swung Mortalis as if it were the very idea of weight. The chain parted, a bloodletter procession, and the pieces found they did not have the confidence to keep being. All at once the square faltered. The prince's shadow flickered like a candle asked a rude question. The rift jittered. The voice came again, and this time it sounded all the way tired. The first legend will be undone. Malchadek took that sentence like a plate and smashed it against the wall. Silence protects the truth, he roared, because now roaring was the reasonable register. The Vox rasped, and then decided to love him for a little while. Silence denies the lie. The plaza shook, because the plaza had been built by men and remembered liking men. Silence judges the unworthy. The last word hit the ground. The ground bowed. The wolves began to fail. The flies discovered they were made poorly. The Bloodletters' swords, those long citations of cruelty, fuzzy-edged and then silly. Thelonious put a final vengeance round into a stubborn argument and let his arm briefly rest. Done, he said. Nobody heard him, and that was all right. Drive them, Barracan said. Don't chase, because chasing is how men die stupid. The Emerald Vow took 2 steps they had earned and held them in the teeth. Kaelin's engines idled, which for Ravenwing is a kind of prayer. We could, but we won't. Celian scanned the geometry, like a man checking a beloved face for bruises. Orath spat a fly into his glove and looked at it with a child's curiosity before someone told him to throw it away. The shadow laughed one more time. It sounded like pages tearing out of a book. The rift folded inward, as if embarrassed to have been seen without a mask. The words that had been nailed into the air worked themselves loose, fell, and lay there, still hot, and then cooled like iron nobody would lift. The plaza did not heal. It remembered being worse, and found that memory more persuasive, and held itself like that. The dead were everywhere, and some of them were not done yet. Garen walked among the survivors of Corvian, and counted, and got it wrong, and frowned and did it again, and then said nothing, because the numbers did not want pity. Ephras found a man with half his face left, and an expression like a child, and told him a small lie about forgiveness, and the man died believing it. And Ephras decided that maybe it had not been a lie after all. Jorath looked down at his own hands and saw the flies that weren't there anymore, and tried to shake them off and could not. Garen bumped him with a shoulder, and the movement gave Jorath back his legs. Thelonious had 6 left. He put them in a row like tools you would keep even if you moved house. Marvek coughed a strip of lung out of his mouth and stepped on it in case it had opinions. Yaron sat down because someone had cut a hole where standing used to go, and he had misplaced the skill. Sergeant, he said, and Thelonious looked over and nodded one nod that meant, I see you and not now, and you did well all at once. Under the banner's tired green, a woman whose breast had been a shrine pressed her lips to the cloth while Malvin wasn't looking. When she found that her mouth had no more use left, a watcher drifted to her and placed parchment gently over it, and the letters went down into her, and she stopped looking like a question. The watchers moved like commas put in too late but salvaging the sense all the same. Silence, said one vellum. Enough, said another. Rest. The words glowed, sank, and the skin forgot it had not been written on. High above, the wrath pushed a sound down through cloud and ash and broken bell metal. It was the groan of a ship remembering something it had promised somewhere very far away. The noise went along the corpses like fingers across a keyboard that had lost half its ivories, and the melody cracked, but still. There was a melody, and that is no small thing. Dominiel voiced across the net, because someone had to make what had happened behave. On Veyla, a rift opened. A shadow spoke prophecy. The hexagrammaton answered, shadow withdrawn, doom postponed. Postponed, Zephanis repeated, as if tasting the word for weaknesses. He spat blood and something he did not investigate further. I hate postponement. Be grateful for it, Lutherian said, and took the weight of his shield into his left shoulder, because the right had gone to live somewhere else for a while. Varadiel? Abriath asked, because someone ought. I am here, the librarian said, which was true enough for this hour. He had both knees under him, and that is what men mean when they say here with their teeth still in. Malkadek, Dominiel said. Silence protects the truth, the chaplain answered, not as litany now, just as a thing worth saying when air is in short supply. Kalen, Varikan added, report. Ravenwing present, Kalen said. Geometry is untangled, for now. His voice made for now sound like a door propped by a bayonet. The rift above the spire gave a last little twitch, and was not a rift anymore. The seam remained if you knew where to put your attention, the way a scar remains when the wound agrees, for the sake of company, to close. Men gathered shells with the guilt of thieves. Watchers took the shells away with the gentleness men reserve for animals and infants. Ephras covered a corpse with the corner of a banner, because the banner had enough room for both jobs, and no one was using that corner at present. Jorath helped Malvern lift the pole from a crack, where it had set like a stubborn tooth. They formed up to leave because staying is how ghosts lay claim to men. As they turned away from the square, someone, no one would say who, looked back and saw, for a single consenting heartbeat, the faintest of silhouettes standing in the seam, as if the world had remembered a bad love and could not help one last glance. The figure lifted a hand, almost a greeting, almost a promise. Then there was only sky going about the work of being sky. They withdrew without turning their backs, muzzles low. Silence came with them as baggage, and did not ask to be set down. This has been Wrath of Angels, Chapter 4, Scene 3, The Daemonic Rising. Chapter 4, Scene 4 follows.